Luckily the hall was dark, and the front door solid. He slipped the things to me through the stair rail, and fumbled long enough at the door to give me a minute or two. But I was trembling all over by the time I had hidden the trousers and the shoes, and had swung the shelves back in place. He gave me a bit more leeway by stopping to turn on the hall lights after he had opened the door. Then I heard him bringing in some men, and although I dread to think of what the Crescent would have said had it known, I was lighting one of Jim's cigarettes when they entered. There were two of them, an Inspector Briggs from headquarters and the detective, Sullivan, whom I had seen in the hall upstairs at the Lancaster house. They eyed me curiously when Jim presented them. "Miss Hall, eh? Then you are the young lady who found Miss Emily Lancaster in the garden?" This was from the inspector. "I didn't exactly find her. I heard her screaming, and ran out. It was Eben who got to her first." "I see." I was bracing myself for the next question, but to my surprise it did not come. Instead he suggested that Mr. Sullivan see me home, and then come back. Evidently he had no idea of letting Jim overhear what I had to say. I had a horrified moment as I rose when I realized that in my anxiety to hide the clothing I had overlooked that with Jim. What would he tell them? Or deny? But Jim settled that for me in surprising fashion. "Don't worry, Lou," he said. "We'll tell the truth and shame the devil. And you can throw away that cigarette. I don't think it's fooled anybody." Inspector Briggs smiled slightly, but his face altered as Jim walked deliberately to the shelves and swung them open. "There's the evidence," he said. "Sullivan took me out, and I came as near to fainting then as I ever have, right there on the Wellington front porch." Chapter 6. Mother had notified Holmes that he was to sleep in the house that night, on the general principle I suppose that having had one murder we might expect any number of them, which was not so absurd after all as it seemed that night. But Holmes as a protection did seem absurd, a scared little rabbit of a man. He trailed at our heels as we locked up that night, careful not to get too far away from one or the other of us. It was from Holmes that I first heard the theory of a homicidal maniac. "I don't mind saying, miss," he confided to me, "that I'm just as glad to be in here tonight. Somebody around here's gone crazy, and that's the truth. It would have to be a lunatic who knows all about us, Holmes." "Well, that's not so hard to do," miss, with everybody living by the clock, as you may say. Except you, Holmes." He grinned at that. "Mother still insists that the servants be in at 10 o'clock at night, but still Holmes has an easy and unobserved exit by the path across no man's land, and I knew perfectly well that there were times when he not only disobeyed the rule, but did not come back at all." But I think now that Holmes tried to tell me something that night, that his following me was not without reason. Later on he must have changed his mind, but I often wonder what would have happened had he followed that impulse. We would not in all probability have had our second murder, for one thing. Also it might have brought into the open the fact that all our servants knew or guessed a great deal more than any of us. As I have indicated, however, the Crescent keeps its domestics in their places, the result being a sort of tacit cabal among them, the backs of our houses, so to speak, against the fronts. And Holmes had no chance that night to speak. Mother returned before he had decided, and having had the best linen sheets ceremoniously removed from the guest room next to hers, installed Holmes there with instructions not to snore, and to rap on her door if he heard anything suspicious during the night. Poor Holmes. Unscrupulous he might have been, and was, but I always had a sneaking fondness for the little man. Incredible as it seems, it was only 10:30 when I finally got to my room, leaving Mother locked and bolted inside hers. It had been only 6.5 hours since I had seen Miss Emily run shrieking out of that door and collapse on the grass, but it had been innumerable years emotionally for me. Not only the murder, not only fear for Jim Wellington, possibly even then under arrest. Alarmed as I was for him, even I knew that a man could not be sent to the electric chair because he had stumbled on an old woman dead in her bed. What also worried me was a sort of terror that I still cared for him. Perhaps it was only sheer pity for his danger, and because I had seen him alone in that empty disordered house, with his servants gone because Helen had spent their money on the exotic clothes, the perfumes and whatnot which seemed more important to her than he ever was. I knew as well as if I had seen her that she was out that night at some club or roadhouse or hotel roof, dancing, and I felt that I hated her for it. This is not a love story, however, and perhaps here I should attempt to tell what the police had discovered up to 10:30 that night, and to outline the Lancaster house itself for better understanding. The first I learned a bit at a time over the next 2 weeks, but the house I knew as well as I knew our own. Indeed, for all practical purposes the two houses were the same. The same builder had constructed them 50-odd years ago, at the time when elaborate scroll and fretsaw work decorated most pretentious country houses, and later on the same architect had added what we called our guest wings, removed his predecessor's adornments and given the dignity of both white paint and plain pillared porches. The Lancaster house, then, is broad and comparatively shallow, presenting its long dimension to the crescent. On the lower floor a wide hallway runs from front to back of the main body of the house. From this hall the front door opens onto the porch, shaded with vines, while the rear door opens on what was the old carriage sweep in front of the long-gone stables, and is now a vegetable garden with the woodshed beyond and shielded from the house by heavy shrubbery.